Thank you so much for having me. So my name's Amy Bromley, and I'm a policy and advocacy lead here in South Australia. I've been a social worker for about 11 years now, I think, and most of my focus has always been in child protection of some sort or family support.
And so, Amy, can you give us a bit about your background of some of the roles that you've held within child protection? I guess you've been in child protection for 11 years, but not all 11 years in frontline, correct?
No, so I really started in frontline as a lot of people do. I am actually originally from South Africa, so that's where I got my Bachelor of Social Work degree. And then I came over to Australia, and like a lot of people, I actually got into child protection through the offer of working regionally, and that being an opportunity to get my permanent residency here in Australia. So child protection initially wasn't actually my focus area. It wasn't an area I particularly wanted to go into. But I just absolutely fell in love with it once I did. So I was working in a fairly small town regionally in Queensland. And there I was a frontline statutory worker. And so I started off being involved working with families who had statutory intervention, but the children were still staying at home. So the families were still intact and was really about making sure that there was enough safety being built in that we either had to make a decision that the children needed to be removed or they could stay at home. So that was my first role, and that was for about 4 years initially.
And for those who've never heard about the Australian system, or specifically where you work, can you give us a sense of um, high overview, but how does it function? We've heard from people from Africa and the Middle East and North America, and the systems differ slightly. So how does if someone makes a call into your system, how does the file work itself through?
Absolutely. So Australia has a child protection orientation. So some systems have a more family support orientation, often in Europe, particularly Scandinavia. But we're a lot more similar to the United Kingdom and the USA in having a real child protection orientation. So quite forensic and a strong focus on going to court and statutory intervention. So when someone makes a call in, and that can be anyone from the community, but we do also have mandatory reporters, which means that some groups of people, for example, social workers or doctors, they're actually legally mandated if they have concerns about a child to call that in. Once the call comes in, a decision is made as to how serious are these concerns, so we know what intervention to put in place. And it could either be an investigation through statutory services, it could be sending to an intensive family support service, it could be sending it to just a more general community service, or it could be sent just closing it because nothing needs to happen. So those sort of decisions are made depending on the concerns.
Okay. And you are, to be clear, your system is, and I'm trying to get the lingo right here. Um, you're not, so for instance, in the Middle East, it's run by NGOs, um, and government. In Canada, where I'm from, it's depends on the province if it's provincial, federal, but it could also be private institutions funded by government. So how is this state run, provincial in Australia?
Yes, so what we've got here in South Australia is really sort of a bit of a combination. And so we have two large government departments. We have Department for Child Protection, which is our statutory intervention for a certain level of risk. And then we have our Department of Human Services, which is our more family support intervention if the risk is lower and the children can remain in the home. Both of those government departments then fund a whole lot of not-for-profits that are involved. Now, not-for-profits typically do a lot of family support work, and they also support foster carers. So the ways that they interact in the system are quite specific. So they don't do investigations or anything like that, but they are there in a more support capacity. And so even after children have been removed, they will often be involved by supporting the foster carers and advocating for the family. And so it really is about having everyone working together in that space. We don't have a lot of purely private involvement of agencies. However, there are some. Um, and we do see a lot of private practitioners perhaps being involved, particularly in the reunification space or in more therapeutic supports that can be brought in. And so those will have to be funded directly by a government department, or if they're not willing to, then sometimes by a foster care or family themselves.
Got it. Okay. And so you did that for how many years? 4 years or
It was
longer?
for about 4 years,
4 years.
yes.
Okay. And then you moved, where did you move after that?
Well, interestingly, after that, I decided to do my master's in social work. So I moved to the US at the University of Michigan.
Right.
And there I really wanted to specialize more in clinical work. So I focused on children and youth and families, emphasizing the clinical aspect. So going more into doing therapeutic support one on one. So that was about an 18-month experience over there, which was absolutely fantastic. Really loved it. And so interesting to be exposed to a different system and way of thinking. But then came back to Australia after that. Again, went to Queensland, now a lot further north. If anyone wants to Google Whitsundays, it is one of the most beautiful areas in the world. So that's where I worked for the next few years. And my focus there was really on doing more therapeutic work. Not just with children and families, I broadened out to working with anyone who'd experienced domestic and family violence or childhood abuse. So now working with adults who'd experienced childhood abuse, very often trying to now parent themselves, but also children who had their own complexities and were working with families. So yeah, shifted into that more trauma-focused intervention approach.
Okay. And is that what you're doing currently?
No, I have shifted again. So I did that for, I'd probably say about, yeah, around another 5 years or so. Then I decided to do my PhD. So I did that here in Australia. So I've got one degree from 3 different countries now. And my focus shifted to thinking more about systems. So, like a lot of frontline practitioners, after spending a while doing the work, you start to become frustrated by you can see how things could be better, but the system gets in the way of them being better. So I thought I really want to take a look at how can I address systems. So my PhD research really focused on how can we get child protection systems to change because there's always so many efforts to try and reform systems. Here in South Australia, we regularly have inquiries or royal commissions, and all these reports come out with hundreds of recommendations of things that must change. Yet, if we look across the decades, the core problems are exactly the same as they were many, many years ago. And so I was really interested in trying to study what can we do differently so that we can start to see these changes we're making actually affect children and families rather than us constantly changing, but nothing ever actually improving. So
Okay.
that's led to me now in my role where I focus on policy and advocacy. So I work in a peak body, and our mission is really just to elevate the voices of the sector. So children, families, carers, agencies who work with them and carry their voices through to government so that decisions are being made and changes are being implemented. They are going to really, really benefit children and families directly. So a lot more about influencing and trying to shift the system.
Nice. So you're going to be able to give us insight into from both perspectives, being on the front line and now seeing it on a yeah,
Mm.
on a
Absolutely.
macro
I think
level.
that is so important. And I've made a commitment myself to always stay connected to frontline work, no matter what I do. So at the moment, I'm busy seeking volunteering opportunities. Before this, I always maintained a bit of a part-time role, still assessing foster carers, because I think if I'm sitting at a high systemic level, um, with my voice being used to carry the experiences of others, I need to know and remember what it's like to sit there talking to someone who's suffering or who's experiencing challenges. I never want to forget what that's like and become disconnected from that. I think it's very easy for leaders to become disconnected, and that's when a lot of poor decisions are put in place.
Right. So given your experience, which is fantastic because you can give as I said, you'll be able to speak to both your frontline experience, but now where you're at now, and maybe have a different perspective or a lot more fine-tuned perspective. What, where do you think, where would you like to start if we wanted to focus on telling the public what child welfare is like from the practitioner's perspective? Where do you think we should start based on your experience? What would be the
Mm.
very first thing you'd like to say?
I think the most important thing is just to realize that it's not just a small group of really awful, horrible parents who are horrifically abusing their children. I think a lot of people, when they think about child protection, that's what they think about because those are, the horror stories that we see in the newspaper, or that's what the movies are about. But for almost all families, that's not it at all. It's families going through a really tough time, who've had struggles with their mental health, who've had their own childhood trauma and are now struggling with addiction because they never got the support they needed to heal. And parenting is hard anyway, and to do it when you've got those additional complexities, it just becomes really difficult. Here in Australia, we're also struggling with a very severe housing crisis. And so we're seeing a lot of families becoming homeless and rough sleeping. And of course, it's almost impossible to try and manage your mental health when you've got that level of stress and manage your parenting. And so all these pressures really, really build and build on families. And that's most of the work that we do is just helping people who've gone through a really, really difficult time and trying to bring in safety and support. And although there are and there always need to be child protection systems, that's actually not the most important thing. It comes from the community. It comes from neighbors caring about each other. It comes from teachers being really invested. It comes from you having affordable and accessible housing available. All those broader parts of the community and our systems are really needed to protect children and families. And so there's a bit of a motto here that says child protection is everyone's business. And we really, really mean that. Making a phone call to get someone investigated is the smallest possible thing you can do to help children and families. It's really about the broader community support.
Okay, so I think it's critical what you've identified for the public to understand that um, families I've done the work myself for many years, so I understand what you're saying when you say, look, the majority of the cases are not the ones you typically showcased in the news or on TV. You're primarily working with families that are struggling addictions and mental health and so on. Can you then, if we kind of zoom in on that point, can you give us a sense of what because I do find in different jurisdictions and areas and countries they have more of a type of file that they see more often than not. What was the is it fair to say that mental health is, because you mentioned that, is that what you saw most of?
So we call it the toxic trio. So we see mental health, domestic and family violence, and drug and alcohol addiction as the primary three. And the complexity has just increased over time. So it's gotten to the point now where it's almost challenging to find a family that doesn't have some combination of those, and most have all three. And then with the housing crisis, housing stress on top of that. So I would say, although there possibly are more prevalent profiles, honestly, the profile we're seeing most is just more complex. So it's multiple complex factors, which has made it really, really challenging on our system. There have been a lot of reports recently about how simply addressing complexity is one of the most pressing needs for our system, because it's no longer you can link someone to one service provider to address this. It's okay, there has to be a really, really clear case plan of how are we going to address these multiple risk factors at the same time, without overwhelming the family, but really just a lot to do. And in an environment where there's very, very limited access to services, so really long wait lists. You might have to wait 6 weeks just to get into a GP, never mind to get into mental health treatment. And so a very, very challenging context. I would probably say complexity is the type of case we see most.
And can you speak to, so what is complexity in your context? So we have mental health. What makes it more complex?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think something that's really, really important first to think about is the difference between risk and complexity. Very often, for me, what we call risk factors are actually complexity factors. So let's look at someone with challenges to their mental health. Is that a risk to parenting or not? Well, if we take a medical model, we can just go, oh, well, yes, of course it is, because it's more likely that your parenting is going to be negatively impacted by it. But a medical model isn't a good fit for child protection work. So instead, you can look at two parents, both with mental health challenges. One might be parenting very successfully, the other might be really struggling. It's not the mental health that makes the difference, it's the actual parenting behaviors as a result of the other support and protective factors that they have in their lives. So, complexity is anything that makes it more difficult to address the risk factors, makes a family more vulnerable to risk factors, increases the severity of risk factors. And so for me, a lot of the things we'd actually list as risk, like drug and alcohol use or mental health, is actually complexity because it's the behaviors themselves of the risk. But complexity means, gosh, it's going to be a lot harder now to change these behaviors or to bring in some positive supports because there's a lot happening for this family that makes them more vulnerable to behaving in ways that are going to negatively impact their children and their development.
Right. So you're speaking about just because someone has mental health doesn't mean that it's impacting their parenting. It's what are the behaviors as a result of mental health that are impactful, if at all.
Absolutely.
So what I understood, and maybe I need to sharpen the question, is you were speaking about cases or referrals becoming more complex because there are additional issues that are is that okay? So what are the
Yes.
additional issues that you're hearing about now that historically maybe were not involved? Whereas
Mm.
what I understood you saying is historically mental health was simply the mental health we dealt with, but now
Yes.
it's become more complex. So what are you seeing over time that's making it more complex than just the one issue? You said
Yeah,
housing.
absolutely. Yeah, fantastic. So, what we're seeing for a lot of families, so domestic and family violence, drug and alcohol use, homelessness, mental health challenges, their own history of childhood maltreatment. So, they were often in care themselves and are now parents. And if have I said homelessness already? If I haven't,
Yeah.
homelessness as well. And so and disability. Sorry, that's the last one. So either children having a disability, parents having a disability, or both. And so there are a lot of families holding all of those complexities at the same time. And
Wow.
so if you think about that from a case planning or support perspective, we're needing to get support for children with disability, for the parents with a disability, needing to get them supported around their mental health, but then there's also drug and alcohol use, but right now they're rough sleeping. So how do you start all of that if they've got nowhere to live at the same time? You might have two parents where there's violence being used by one against the other. And so it's thinking about how do you support them in a way that's going to empower them. Perhaps they want to separate, perhaps they don't. And so you've got all of that happening at the same time with children sitting in the middle. And it can just be really overwhelming to even know how to start with a case like that. There's a really fantastic study called the Australian Childhood Maltreatment Study that looks at the level of trauma that people have experienced during childhood. And
Mm-hmm.
it shows that it's a lot more common than anyone thought. That most people, so over half of our population, have experienced some sort of childhood maltreatment. And it also shows that how many people have actually experienced multiple examples of childhood maltreatment, which sort of explains a bit about why we're seeing so much of that complexity now.
I see. Okay. Thanks for that. So I have a few questions now that I'm thinking are I want to ask you because you've got the perspective of the micro and the macro and from a systemic perspective. So in your area, um, what are the your typical processes, um, more so the legal framework or processes that shape decision making in child welfare intervention? Are they sort of unique? You said, or are they I think you mentioned that they're similar to the US and the UK. Is that the case?
Yes, so the overall process is quite similar in the sense that there's a heavy focus on having a threshold for statutory intervention.
Okay.
And so everything is around determining is the level of harm or risk, has it reached that threshold? And if so, that then triggers a specific set of interventions. Here in South Australia, we just very recently had a new piece of child protection legislation passed in Parliament. So that
Okay.
will be coming into effect in the next few years. So, very, very recent legislation designed to try and improve what's happening here. Some really, really good changes in that legislation that's going to make a big difference, including some of the things I've mentioned, like bringing in other departments to really broaden our support. But still, overall, our system is very much focused on um, a lot more like a criminal system. So it's about coming in, doing an investigation, gathering evidence, going to court, proving that these parents shouldn't have their children in their care. And so it's got a very punitive and forensic lens to it. Which can be, from my understanding, quite different from other places where it really is about supporting families early on. And so, although our system does try to support families and there's a lot of push to do that more, ultimately we can still see um, because there's such a focus on having to prove your case in court,
Mm-hmm.
one that's intervening with that family is trying to gather evidence. And so it has a very different feel to it compared to families just feeling like they're being supported. So I'd say that that really drives what's happening for us.
Yeah, very similar, almost identical to the Canadian system, where um,
Mm,
the feeling that you're you need to defend yourself,
yes,
almost as though this happened, the allegation was made, and I have to prove it didn't. And you're right,
yes.
the gathering the evidence and um you it, the concept of threshold in your jurisdiction, who defines threshold? What the parameters are? Is it a practitioner based, or is this the system gives you the parameters that you can kind of play within?
That is a very interesting question. So the threshold is stated in legislation, but as we know, uh, interpreting legislation, it can look very different on the ground. So the threshold is now shifting to looking at significant harm. And there are some definitions within the legislation that sort of describe that quite clearly. But at the same time, when someone is working in frontline practice, we know they're drawing on many other sources of evidence to try and interpret and understand if that threshold has been reached. So we do still currently have structured decision-making tools that use an algorithm to predict the level of risk based on factors for a family. And so that will provide some guidance. And then, of course, practitioners themselves, along with supervisors and managers, drawing on their experience to determine. So a lot of sources of evidence are brought together in order to make a determination there about the threshold. And it will be very interesting to see now that our threshold is changing. So it's actually being raised a bit higher. So with the intention of trying to shift more families to the support system and
Mhm.
remove later. Um, it'll be interesting to see across the next probably 5 years what changes in practice and what impact does that change in threshold have. And if it doesn't have much of a change, to sort of question, okay, well, perhaps there's something else that's actually determining how practitioners are implementing that threshold on the front line.
Right, because threshold, you said use the word it's um interpreted, and so
Mm.
and to me it always struck me that it's subjective and it's personal paradigms and interpretation can
Mm.
be more moral based, and so were you finding that it's quite similar now where you sit now in a policy role versus on the front line? Is that, yeah, the
Absolutely.
same?
Yeah, absolutely. I can give a bit of a story as an example, and this is from when I was working in the front line. And there was a young person who was living with a carer, but it was a very interesting arrangement in that um, mum struggled with her mental health. So this young person would spend a bit of time with the foster carer while mum wasn't doing well and go home when mum was doing well. And that was a really good arrangement because it really kept her connected to family, but provided mum with support and this child with safety when needed. Um, but this foster carer kept putting in complaints against the mother for child abuse. One of the complaints was that the child does not shower twice a day. She felt that it's child abuse if a child doesn't shower twice a day. And so we could hear there for this foster carer, her threshold was, in my opinion, very, very low compared to what I'm used to. And certainly, when talking to members of the community, you can hear thresholds like that. When we're thinking more about practitioners in the front line, we might see definitions like psychological harm or emotional harm. Who determines what that looks like for a child? It can be really, really difficult to decide at what point is too much emotional harm, at what point is it too much emotional harm? Because of course, children are going to be emotionally harmed with parents. You get angry, you yell. Later on, you have to apologize. That's part of parenting. At what point is it no longer a natural part of parenting and doesn't become maltreatment? And that's not an easy line to draw.
Yeah. No, no, you nailed it, right? It's and then I found that in where I used to work, if you walked down the hallway, depending on the team
Mm,
you talked to, one the same exact case would have different outcomes.
absolutely,
From a child coming
absolutely.
into care to a child not coming into care. And that's pretty terrifying
It is
uh,
really, really
for
terrifying.
families and to function that like that in a system as a system. So uh, are you is this new legislation right now, is it trying to tackle the concept of this concept that we're touching on now?
I don't know if legislation can influence what we're discussing now. I think the legislation has tried to raise that threshold high enough to avoid unnecessary removals. So I do think, in some senses, that will really help because it's shifted that burden of proof in court to have to be quite a bit higher, so that practitioners have to be a lot more certain before they can remove a child and be willing to go to court. So they have to do a lot more before to provide support to a family. So I think in some ways it makes it clearer, but it's still not going to necessarily shift how decisions would be made different depending on the practitioner you've got to involve. And we know it's not just decisions around remove or don't remove. There's also decisions about, well, what level of support are we going to give you? What level of funding maybe? We often hear in our advocacy unit, some families will receive really, really high levels of support. Okay, we'll pay for this family to get EMDR treatment. Okay, they're struggling to pay their rent at the moment. We'll cover the rent for 3 months while they get back on their feet. Whereas in other offices, no, you don't get that. You access public mental health services. If you can't pay your rent, find somewhere cheaper. That's it. And so even if we're not thinking about the difference between that bigger decision making for a child's trajectory, we see a lot of differences in the level of support that's provided. And I think a lot of that comes from this idea of do parents deserve our help or not? Sometimes you'll talk to practitioners and you hear a bit of a narrative of, if they really cared about their children, they would X, Y, Z. They would work harder. They'd show up on time for appointments. They'd stop taking drugs. If you really loved your children, you wouldn't keep using drugs. And so we see a lot harsher decision making and a lot less support given to those parents because of those underlying beliefs of practitioners.
Right. So it's fascinating that the threshold conversation, the way that they've gone about addressing it currently, it's more so lessening the legal burden rather than focusing on capacity building for staff to step into assessments in a more rigorous and sophisticated way, focusing on your mindsets and how to, yeah, work that through.
Mm.
That's just fascinating.
Yeah.
Um, what about in your role again, any what you're seeing right now or experiencing in terms of systemic and from a policy perspective? Are there any cultural norms or societal attitudes that you say that are playing in how child welfare is being managed, impacted, influenced?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have really, really high reporting rates in South Australia. The stats shift, but around 1 in 3 children will have
Wow.
a report of child maltreatment against them at some point in their lives. So the reporting culture in South Australia is really, really high, and that is one of the reasons for the legislation trying to shift that threshold and be a bit clearer, is to sort of get the message out that support before reporting investigation, to try and shift that mindset a bit. So certainly that forensic reporting culture is very strong. Also across Australia, what we're really seeing is a resurgence of this punitive focus, particularly towards young people.
Mm.
So there was a campaign to raise the age of minimum criminal responsibility. So currently it's sitting at 10 years old. At 10 years old, you
Oh,
are determined to be criminally responsible for acts. And so there was a push to shift that up to 14, and it was rejected. Only one state has actually adopted it. All other states, including South Australia, are retaining a minimum age of 10 years old. And new legislation is coming out that's really, really punitive to young people. Now, what we know when we look at the youth justice system is that there's a really strong intersection of those young people involved in crime are the
mhm.
same young people who experienced childhood maltreatment and have had a significant trauma across their lives. So it's a real concern to me that there's this strong narrative of we need to punish. That's coming across to parents. It's now applying to young people. And I think that's really going to influence where our funding goes.
Mhm.
And it's really going to influence the way that people start to think about and just treat the people in our systems. This idea, if we punish them enough, they'll stop. So we're seeing a lot of money going into prisons, going into policing, but not going into more mental health services, not going into all these supports that we know would make a really big difference in early intervention.
Interesting. Um, okay. And what about, and maybe you can answer this from the perspective of the practitioner, but now in your role, in your current role as well. What would you say in your jurisdiction in South Australia are the like practitioners? What are the challenges they're facing that are unique to your jurisdiction?
I don't know what's quite unique to our jurisdiction. For South Australia, we're in a position where we're quite a small state compared to sort of our some of our really big states, particularly New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, where there's sort of a lot more funding and bigger population. Um, and so we do find that tends to influence sort of the way our system works and things like that. What I think is the biggest challenge, though, and it's not just unique to us, it's certainly across Australia, and I know other countries as well, is just the turnover of the workforce.
Mm.
And for me, I think that's probably the number one thing that I think would make the biggest difference to improving the child protection system. Because all those wonderful things we spoke about earlier, where we're supporting practitioners to develop, engage with families in a more nuanced way and really think very critically about thresholds and the influence on children and make really well-informed decisions. That can't happen when your supervisor has only been in practice for 2 years, when they're a supervisor already, because they're one of the longest lasting members in your team. And so we're seeing turnover happening within 3 months of people just coming in and leaving almost immediately. Our average turnover rates at the moment for statutory system is 1.5 years. So people they're just not making it
How come?
to a point where they can build evidence. Yeah.
How come? What's within your system right now that's causing so many
Hmm.
to leave?
It's
Well, what
it's a
would they
number
say?
Yeah, it's a number of things. So, firstly, this is an area we really need to research more. It's something that I've put together a bit of a proposal, and we're seeking to start to actually understand it. So, I'd say there's sort of two major influences. The one is really just the level of distress practitioners are feeling within systems. Because of all the things we've spoken about already, the high levels of complexity, the very punitive and defensive focus. People who come into this work, they come into it because they want to help, because they want to support children, because they want to see good outcomes. But then you find yourself in court having to defend your decisions and doing more paperwork than actually spending time talking to children and listening to them. And it suddenly starts to feel like you're not sure if you're helping. In fact, maybe even you're hurting families. And you really question, is this work that you can sustain? And certainly that's what happened to me in my role. Is it got to the point where I thought I no longer know if I trust the system to be doing good, and I can't be part of a system that I'm not sure is doing good. And that's not because of the intentions of the system being wrong or any of the people in the system being bad. It's just the point that we've gotten to. And so I think things like reducing administrative work and really shifting it back to building relationships, listening to children, engaging with families, reducing caseloads so that you've got the time and space to actually focus and think about the work that you're doing, and reorienting away from that very defensive and forensic culture to thinking about offering the maximum support possible. We really need to see active efforts towards doing everything to keep families together and to keep children connected to their communities and culture. And I think if we could shift that, we'd see so many more practitioners stay. They would come back because it's really about being values driven. So that's my really big focus in my work.
Okay. So similar to issues here in North America and the UK, um, almost identical. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so what would you say, and this question leads to a fairly typical answer, but I'm going to go with it anyway. Maybe it's different in your area, but what are the um um misconceptions that about child welfare, child protection in your area that the public has?
That the public has. I think, similar to what I said before, I think the public often thinks about sort of the really serious harms. So they think about things like sexual abuse or really, horrible physical abuse or children being, locked outside and things like that, and not realizing that, well, actually, a lot of what we're talking about is children living in environments where, there's violence perhaps not being used directly against them, but amongst the adults in the household, where there's this ongoing sort of emotional stress and tension, where it's chaotic, where they're not always getting to school, where they're not sure if mum's going to wake up today and be okay and be able to take care of them, or be having a really, really bad day where she just doesn't, or she doesn't come out of her room today. And so I think it's a lot harder for the public to think about that type of cumulative harm, which is what we're really seeing, where there's not one clear incident where it says, okay, this is so bad, we can make a very clear decision now. It's what does it look like for a child or young person to live in this home 24/7 every day, and what does that slowly do to their development and their trajectory in life. And that makes decision making a lot harder. So I think, yeah, I would love for the public to understand that it's very hard to come in and to not have one event that's happened to help you make a really easy decision, but to have to sit there and to try and think about what's going to be best for this family across the next 10, 18 years to help this child really develop well.
Right. Yeah. Agreed. And what if you could share your best thinking about how communities or policymakers or organizations support your work, what would you suggest needs to
Mm.
happen or others can do to help support what you're trying to do?
I would say that we just need to reorient all of our society to having families held at the center. Doesn't matter what system or what service you are, have families held at the center, because ultimately that's the only thing that really matters. That's the foundation of our whole society. And instead, what I often see is that families get pushed to the side. And so, my work is most important, but I'll take carer's leave if I have to. Or, all these things happen where family comes second. And it really shouldn't be that way. So I'd love to see our health systems, our teachers receiving so much more money because they are such an incredibly valuable part of our society and having small classes where children are really nurtured by having all these adults around them. So just shifting all of those systems to think about families. And one of the key things is just any system that works with adults, ask yourself, is this adult a parent? And if so, hold that children or child in mind, because they then are directly your client as well. So no matter what we're doing, we can always have that family focus across our communities.
Okay. Is there something, a question I haven't asked? I mean, there are lots of questions I can ask, but I'm mindful of your time and I don't want to take too much of it. But is there a question that you think is incredibly important that I should ask and haven't asked? Or anything you'd like to add or say that you haven't already?
I think what I would like to add is just that ultimately relationships are everything. Um, when we think about safety, we often focus on physical safety, but we really need to hold relational safety in mind and
Mhm.
think about how can we keep children feeling relationally safe and connected to their family, to their culture, to their community. And as practitioners, am I offering relational safety? Am I really listening? Am I acting on this child's voice? Am I meeting them consistently so they know who I am? Am I being transparent and explaining things? Is the turnover so high in my organization that this child is constantly experiencing loss from the people who say that they're there to support this child? And is the way I do my work and our systems oriented to focus on building up relationships? Because healing always happens in relationships. And so if we're not prioritizing relationships, we're not prioritizing healing for children and families.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for all your insights and thank you for agreeing to do this.
No, thank you so much. I hope it went okay. I had a lot of construction happening outside
Yeah,
and
don't
an
worry.
electrician's just walked past, so I was a bit
Fine.
distracted, but I hope that's okay.
It's fine.